So as a senior developer, this is something you should know in an application. So it is to implement CSRF protection in a full stack app. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to understand what CSRF protection is and how we would use it in the app to keep our website secure. So essentially this blog says how to implement CSRF protection in a full stack React and Express app. So we will have a front end and back end. If you like reading, then read this blog as well. But essentially, what it is we'll build a project that demonstrates how to implement cross-site request forgery, which is CSRF protection, in a React application backed by a Node Express server. So we'll be doing Node and React in this tutorial. CSRF is a type of attack where malicious sites trick a user's browser into performing unwanted actions on a different site where the user is authenticated. So essentially, we want this CSRF protection to stop this from happening. So you learn how to set up secure communication between the front end and the back end. So essentially, what it does is it sets up a secure communication between your Express server and your React application. So that's what it does. Express backend using CRS tokens. And by the end of this tutorial, you'll have a working app with built-in protection against CSRF attacks. So if you have a full stack app, what normally happens is this is already implemented, or you would have to implement this. A popular framework that I use is Next.js, and in there, in the Node modules, what they have is this protection enabled already, and I'll show you that later on in this video. What is CSRF and why does it matter? So again, it's a security vulnerability that occurs when malicious websites make a request to a different site on behalf of an authenticated user. So without proper validation, this request can carry out sensitive actions such as, and you can see here, transferring funds, records deletion, and also changing account details. So what we need to do is we need to protect this on our site, and that's where we do it on our Express server, pass it down to our client. So this is an example of how it works and then how the CSRF token works. So how does the attack work? So if I was someone hacking a site, for example, that had data that I needed, then what you would do is you log into the website, the user visits a malicious site, so evilsite.com, while still being authenticated on example.com. So think about that again. I've logged into, say, for example, imrancodes.com, and then I log into x.com or something like that, but I'm already logged into imrancodes.com in my browser. Then the malicious site sends a forged request to example.com, which in my case will be imrancodes.com, that appears to be from the user. So if my site doesn't have the protection, it will process the request as if it came from me who's logged in as a legitimate user. That's how the attack works. And then what CSRF does is it generates a unique secret token or a value. So this is where we hash and do our hashing of our CSRF token, or we would use an external npm package. So the token creates a unique, secret, and unpredictable value generated by the server. So it's always coming from the back end to the front end. That is the process from top to bottom. And then it's then associated with the user's session. So example would be if you were fetch request to API, you would pass in that token as well as part of your Axios request, for example. So we'll look at that later as well. But this token is then validated on the server side. And if the token is missing or incorrect, then the request is rejected. So that's how it works. It's quite confusing to understand at the start. So we'll look at examples. So we'll look at how to implement our own custom CSRF middleware. We will also look at external packages that we can use in the npm library. And then we will also look at Next.js, where they already have this included in their Node modules. So we'll look at all of that. So what we want to do is we want to get started. So in this project, we communicate with the Express backend and the front end. So again, here you can see we will generate a CSRF token for each session. We pass this down to the React app, and then we use this token to validate post requests to ensure that they are legitimate. So again, any type of request really. And then this is the structure. So what we'll do next is get started with the build. Right, so what we want to do is we want to set everything up. So let's just follow this project structure that we've created over here. So let's open our terminal, and then in our terminal, navigate to the folder that you want to have your file in. So in here, let's actually make a directory, and we're going to call this CSRF, like that. And then we want to cd into CSRF, like so. And now we want to open our VS Code. So you do code space dot, like that. And then this will open our VS Code terminal. And then in here, let's just expand this and just zoom in a little bit. So what I want to do is I want to create two folders. So if you look at the structure again, in our CSRF, we have a back end and a front end. So front end, we'll probably use something to bootstrap it, like create React app. So we'll go with that one. I think that's what I used in this anyway. And then let's go ahead and create the backend folder. So this will be our Express app. And then also let's just open our terminal in here. And in this terminal now, what we want to do is create the app that we want. So you can see here it says make directory backend, and then we create our Express server. So actually we'll do that first of all. So we'll do our Express server. So npm init-y, what that does is it creates our package.json for us. So npm init-y, and this will create a backend package.json over here. What you need to do is move it into the backend folder actually, like that. So now if we open this folder, you can see a package.json in here. And then let's just actually cd into backend in our terminal. So we've changed the directory into our backend, and then we're going to paste in what we want to install. So we want to use Express for our Express app, CSRF, which is a package for CSRF that handles everything for us. We want cookie parser and cause. We need cause because we're going to be having an Express server and a React application as well. So they need to be able to communicate to each other. So let's install that now. And there's other packages other than CSRF, but for this example, it's quite a popular one that a lot of companies use. Recently, though, there has been any security vulnerabilities with this package because this package is now deprecated. So therefore, you should find an alternative. So if we go on npm in here, and then in npm, if we do CSRF like that, you'll see a few packages in here. You can use CSRF like this. There's quite a few, but let's just click on this one. And you can see here it's got still quite a lot of weekly downloads, but the last published was 5 years ago. So we want to either find an alternative, which there are, or we could just use this one. If you're not so worried about security vulnerabilities in your application, it's more for more secure websites. You would need a package that has no security vulnerabilities. So that's something to bear in mind as well. But for this example, we'll use this. So all you need to do is npm CSRF and so on. But again, this is the docs. If you want to look at them, you can do. But what we want to do now, we've installed everything in here. We want to create a server.js file, or you can have an index.js file. And then essentially, let's copy everything across here, and then we'll explain what's going on. So back in here, we have now installed everything. We have a package lock, and we also have the node modules in the backend. So this is our Express app. Let's clear this, and then in here, what we want to do is we want to create this as a server. The min is here. We need to create a start command. So let me just delete this. So this is when we run npm start, and this command is going to be node server.js. You can install nodemon as well, which it listens to any changes you have made on your Express app, but we're just going to keep it as this. So what we will need to do is obviously close down our terminal and reopen. So that's fine. And then this is myself, Imran Codes. And then if you look down, we have dependencies, and these are the ones we installed. So you can see here Express, CSRF, which is 1.11.0, cause and cookie parser. So that is everything in here. We could put some description in. So a project to demonstrate CSRF protection. So that's essentially what it is. So let's save that. And then now we need to create in the backend folder, the server.js file, and then paste in the code that we copied earlier, and then we'll run through it. So at the top, we would import our packages that we have installed. So we have Express, Cookie Parser, CSRF cause, and we initialize our app. So it's, in our case, it's Express. We initialize that. We define a port because we need a port number of 5000. Then we set up the middleware. So in the middleware, I'll just space these out a little bit so it makes more sense. So the middleware is a step that happens before we run any sort of routes or any API routes or anything like that. This is an extra step that we would have to do if we didn't have the middleware set up. So middleware essentially does some transformations for us that we don't need to do all of the time later on in the application. So In this example, we're using cookie parser, which parses the cookie, and we could put a comment in here saying parse cookies, so you can read it when we upload the code. Again, this is a handy middleware, express.json, which parses our JSON request. So when we get JSON from the server, we want to also parse it, removing that extra step. And then also CORS, which is allow cross-origin requests for development. So basically working with React application as well. Then we have our CSRF protection. So this method here is coming from this CSRF package. And in here, we're passing in cookie true. So if we want to see further into the CSRF package, what we can do is command and click. And in here, this says this is a function and it takes in options. So you can see this is where we pass in what we need. So in our case, we are passing in the cookie, and this cookie value is either a cookie option, Boolean, or undefined. So in our case, this type, so with TypeScript, we have the types, we want to pass in cookie as true. We could also ignore methods and have a session key, but we'll leave it as simple as that for now. You can see here we have a namespace as well, which is in the request object of Express, adds the CSRF token as well, and that's going to be a string. This is not in the request object as per normal, but what we essentially do is we append that so it's there on our request object if we was using TypeScript. If you scroll down again, you can see here declare namespace CSRF and then extend some options in here. But this is how you would read external third-party packages. You can see here this is in our node modules types CSRF, and then in CSRF you have a load of options. That is what packages are. They're basically little modules that you can create and build, and then that therefore you serve it to whoever is using it. So if you want to know how to build this further, I have created a React component library that is basically a library that you publish to npm, then other people can use it. So that's another handy video to watch, so please watch that, and I'll link in the description as well. So that is essentially what this function is, the CSRF function. So let me close this down. So essentially we're giving the variable here, and then what we want to do then is serve the React build file. So again, we want to use app, which is the express up here at the top, express app.use express.static, and then this is where you have the path saying this is the path and you join it. So it's going to be front end slash build. We need to create our front end, so that's what we'll be looking at later on. Then what we do is we have an endpoint to get the CSRF token. So in our case, it's a get request. So it will be /API/CSRF token. We pass in the CSRF protection in here. So the get request is the endpoint. So if we hover over this actually, and I'll click into it, it takes in the path here, which we have at the top. Then we have any handlers. So that's our CSRF protection handler. And then we have a callback function. So what we want to do is close this down. We get the request and response. Again, if you're using TypeScript, you can see here, this is the request type. And then what the CSRF package does is it extends the type for us. So that's essentially what we looked at earlier. And then we have a response. So in our case, we make the API call, we get a response.json of CSRF token equal to request.csrf token, like that. And that is essentially how we set it. So that's how we would get our CSRF token from the front end. And we call this endpoint over here. Then we can have an example of a form submission endpoint as well. So this is API/submit form. We want the CSRF protection on here also to say that when we actually submit a form, we want to make sure this is protected. So therefore, we would then add the handler of the CSRF protection. And then that basically, if that is valid and everything works on that, then we can execute what comes after in the function, which is this callback over here. So request response, in the body of the request, we get the username, and we'll console log receive username from the username. Then again, we are able to submit the form successfully. So that's where we have two endpoints over here. Then we have a fallback to serve the React app for any other routes, which is star, which is essentially everything else. And we essentially send the file, which is the build index.html file there. So finally, we are listening to port 5000 in here. and that's just telling us that the server or the Express app is running. So that is the run through of the server.js. If we go back in our blog, that's step one complete. Now, what we want to do is do step two. So, what we can do, this is a typo, but essentially, npm create React app, and then this is going to be called front end. So, let's go back in our VS Code, and instead of getting out of this one, let's create a new terminal, and then this time we are going to do ls. So you can see we have a backend folder, but now what we want is a front end folder like that, and this is the React application. So this is going to create our React application now, and once that's done, we will be right back. Right, so now our create React app has installed. All you need to do is cd to front end like that, and then let's do npm start, and essentially this will start our React application. So what we need to do is open up localhost 3000. So we'll do that in here. So now you can see we have our create React app over here, and then also we have the backend, but we are not running that at the minute. We just need to finish off our front end. So let's expand this. You can see here we have a node module and a source folder with our package JSON. So again, let's close this one down and open source. We want to do a bit of a cleanup, so we can actually delete all of this stuff. But if we go in index.js, you can see here it renders our app. We append to document of root in here. In app.js, we have a lot of things going on, but what I want to do is just close this down like that. We don't need the logo as well. And this time what I'm just going to call this is the CSRF app. So now you can see we have a CSRF app in here. And if we go back into our blog, so in here, you can see now is scroll up. What we need to do, we cd into our front end, which we have done. We need to install Axios to make HTTP requests. So let's do that in our server, and then in app.js here, we'll import this code. And there's a lot going on in here, but I'll explain it as well. So let me just close our app down and install Axios like so. And also, whilst that's happening, let's just copy across everything to do with the front end, which is essentially the app.js or TS, wherever it is in here, app.js, and paste that in. So now what we want to do is we want to be able to see how the front end and the back end works. So in our case now, we have Axios installed, and we are using hooks from React like this. And the version of React we actually using is the latest, so 18. So that is the version. So essentially we have the app, which is a React component. So in here, there's a lot going down. We have a return block. We won't worry about that for now. So let's close that. And then we have 1, 2, and 3 functions in here. So what we want to do is explain them. So first of all, we want to have some piece of state that defines the initial state for the app. In our case, CSRF token is empty like that. And then we also have form data. So in our case, it's the username. So if you go back into server.js in here, we need the username in the body to be able to verify that they are able to submit the form. So therefore, this is why we need the username here. And also we need the CSRF token to get the endpoint to get the CSRF token. So let me just close this down as well. Back in app.js over here, we have defined our initial state in here, and then we need something to happen once our page loads or our component mounts. So let's say when I run into npm start, let's just do npm start for now. This is what should happen when this opens here. So this React app is injected into the browser, and then you can see now we have a form. Our username is empty, like you can see there. And what we want to do is run something in the use effect. So this is the fetch CSRF token. But what will happen is, because we're not running anything here, it will fail. So we should see this error in the logs. So if we open our console and open this, and in console over here, expand here, you can see it says error fetching CSRF token Axios error. That is the error that we get from Axios saying 404, which is not found. Again, we do that again, and you're seeing it twice because we're using React strict mode, so it will render once and then render again. So if we go into our React application in index.js, you can see here we have strict mode on like that. It generally just is for development purposes. Or if we save that, and actually we don't need that. So let's save it. And what happens this time, it only runs once, you can see like that, but we need strict mode on because we're in development. So let's just go back in here and save that again. And then you'll get your two logs as per usual over here. This makes sense because what you're doing is you're fetching to get the CSRF token from our Express server, but what's happening is we're not running it. So this server, we're not able to connect to this because we haven't got it run on here. And to run it again, you go into package.json, and it's this one npm start for node server.js, which starts this server, and then when it is running, you'll get this console log saying server running on port 5000 in our case, or whatever the port is that you defined. So again, let's go back into our app.js on the client and see how we would fetch the CSRF token. So when we fetch with APIs, what generally happens is that is an asynchronous request. So we need to wait for that to resolve, which is a promise. So we get a resolve reject value in there. So this is why we do the try catch. And you can also have a finally, but we don't need it in this case. So in our try, what we are doing is we are awaiting axios.get slash API slash CSRF token. So let's just copy this and go into server and command F&V. And this one here is the endpoint to get the CSRF token. The middleware runs here. If everything is valid and fine, then we send the JSON response back to the client. So in our case, in the request object, in our case, the CSRF token will be the request.csrf token like that. So that's how it would work. And then what we do is we set the CSRF token to response.data.csrf token. So basically, this piece of state will update. So at the top, we have this available to us to be used. So again, there's a lot of use of the word CSRF, but again, that's the best way to describe it. So what we do is we get our response in the data. We have access to this, which is coming from the request.body CSRF over here, which is request.body.csrf token, this one down here. So that is what we're doing in the try block. If everything is fine, that's great and amazing. So what I also can do to double check this is we can do this over here, or just to see it's being set, or we could just log it as well in. We could log this piece of state in here. So again, we're declaring this and then we are invoking it. Now what you can do as well is all of these functions could be set separate in a helper file. That way your app.js won't get too cluttered. But in our case, we can just minimize that now because we've covered it. And again, this will only happen once on mount. So when we have these array brackets over here, that just basically means rerun this either at the start, or you can pass in the value whenever certain value changes, then run it again. But in our case, we just want it on component mount, saying that when we start the application, we need to fetch the CSRF token. So that's the first one. Then we have a handle form input change, which is essentially updating the form data value. So in our case, it's just getting the username and updating that in our form over here. And then again, we want to handle the form submission. So in our form submission, what we would do is we get the E, which is the event object. So let's go back down in here. So in our return block, we have this form. We have the H2, the form on submit. So in here we have our value and on change, which is going to handle the change for us. And then when we submit, handle submit is called. Again, we need to update the value whenever we type in. So in our case, because we are using use state, then each type we do, it re-renders this app.js file. So bear that in mind when you're working with the use state on forms, or you could use uref as well, but that's up to you. And then if we handle change, so let's go back into the handle change function. We're passing in the event object, and then in here we prevent the default behavior, which means we don't want to refresh all the time. So once we've done that, we have a try catch block again, and this is a asynchronous function because again we're using Axios to do a post request this time and not a get request. So again, if we search this endpoint in our server, we're not getting the CSRF token now. We are going to be posting the form in here like that. And this is an extra validation to say that actually this person is on our site and they are who they say they are. So therefore, we can then log the username and also return the response.json as the form is submitted successfully. So that is fine. So let's go back in app.js. But what we do is in the post method, so in axios.post, you can see here it's basically got the URL, we have the data, and we have some extra config. So let's close this down. We have the URL, we have the data, and any extra config in here. So what we want to do in our headers is we want to add the x-csrf token as the updated token that we have updated once we open our application. So when we open the application and the backend server is running, in here, our CSRF token will be logged. So that is fine. If it's an error like this, then what will happen is this handle submit won't work, and then therefore it will error out and go into the catch block where we then get this, which is error submitting form and error. So let's actually show you how that would work. So this is running, and let me just type in Imran code in here. And when I press submit, what will happen is I'll clear my console. When I press submit, you should see the console error that we have in our catch block over here because we are not able to make this API request because our backend server isn't running. So again, let's press submit, and you can see here error submitting form, and then we get the Axios error as well. So this is a good sign because again, we want to make sure our site is secure and we want to prevent cross-site request forgeries. So far so good. And then in here, when we make our Axios call, this CSRF token is what we need to send to the server, and we need to validate that in our CSRF protection middleware in here. So the middleware, again, if you go up, CSRF in here, which is the package, this is what essentially validates everything for us. So again, this is handy for us, or we can create our own middleware, which we will do later as well. So now, if we go back into our blog, you can see we've done this part over here, and now we need to build the React application. So essentially, with the build folder, we need to kind of deploy that and then host that on a URL somewhere and then run the application. So we're not going to do that. I'm just going to show you a quicker, easier way to test that this works. So instead of using the front end build folder, what we'll do is instead of that, it'll be slash source and then slash index.js. So that's where we are running our application. So this way we will be able to do npm start and then test our application. And then the same here, front end source slash index.js like that. So now let me save this. And then what we need to do is do npm start, and we have our backend running as well like that. And if you see in the token state over here, we actually get the CSRF token, which is this one over here. So that's handy. And now that basically is run in the use effect. So in our app, so app.js over here, you can see at the top, we are logging the CSRF token, and we are also logging the CSRF token state like that. So that is coming from the backend. So again, we make the API request. So it's localhost 5001 slash API slash CSRF token, which is again this endpoint over here. We do the CSRF protection middleware in here, and then this returns the CSRF token from the request object in here. So that is that one set. Right, so now that we've done and tested this endpoint over here, what we want to do is test the second one, which is when we submit a form. We want to, first of all, submit the form, check that the CSRF is valid, and then we get access to the username in the request.body. And then again, if all being well, we'll have form submitted successfully. So that is what we need to test now. And then in here, what I've done is I've added the log for the CSRF token here to see if we're getting it in our React application, which we are doing. And then I've also logged it in the handle submit over here. So now let's just run our backend. So npm start. Now the server is running on localhost 5001, and then we have our React application running as well. So if we refresh the page, and now you can see we are getting our CSRF token over here. Again, let's just check in the application as well. So if we go in application, in the cookies, we need to set it. So we have one here, but let's just clear the cookies and here as well. Now what we want to do is submit the form. So again, if we run through the process of what's going to happen is we'll do a post request, passing in the headers of XCSRF token and the CSRF token in here. This is the one we've logged already in the console, and then we should get alert form submitted successfully. So I'm going to test this out, and I think this will fail. And if it does fail, then that is a good sign, because we need to enforce some more changes in our code. So on our server side and also our client side. So let me submit this. And now you can see here it says post submit form 403 forbidden. So that is good, because again, even though these are matching, so in the handle submit and so on, we need to enforce some further checks. So that's a good sign. So basically, this is saying that actually, if we go back into our blog, if we go right to the top, it says, why does it matter here? So it's a security vulnerability that occurs when a malicious website makes a request to a different site on behalf of an authenticated user. So because we're using this site is the React app on 3000 and the server is on 5001, we need to be able to say that this is actually verified. So this is where we need to add some extra steps, extra checks in place. So that's good. So in our code, if we go in our code, and there's a few steps we need to do. So the first step, I'm just going to bring in the code, and in our server, first of all, we have this code set up here, which is allow cross origin requests for development. That's fine. But what we want to do is we want to specify the origin. So in our case, it is localhost 3000. So this is the only origin we should be using at the minute. Then what we want to do is the CSRF protection, which is here. Then we want to use the CSRF protection like so. So app.use, serve the React build files. In our case, is serve the React files like that. So we also need to add the cookie in here. So let me just quickly add that in and bring it in. So in here we have response.cookie XRF token is equal to the token. So this sets the CSRF token in the cookie. And again, it returns the JSON response in the body as well of the CSRF token. So this is all to do with the use effect that is running in the client. So let me just first of all double check that this is working fine. We are receiving this set CSRF token, which is logged here as CSRF token state. So now that's the cause part complete. What we now need to do is we are defining the CSRF protection over here, and then we are using this protection, which is basically this third-party package that we have. We're serving the React files over here, and then we are essentially getting the endpoint to get the CSRF token. So that's all good, and we're passing in the token in here. But what we also want to do is pass in the cookie. So I'm just going to bring that in as well, and we want to set the cookie over here, and that is going to be to this, which is rec.csrf token. Let me save that. And what we want to do is we want to be able to test that this is still working. So let me do npm start on our backend to restart our express server. Let's actually do the front end as well, npm start once again. So now that's all fine. We're getting the token state, so the CSRF token is working correctly. Let me just test to see if this submits, which it doesn't, which is what we expect. So now what we want to do is work on this one here. So again, the CSRF protection is the handler or the middleware that is run before any request or response is made. So if it passes this check, then again, the callback over here will obviously log the received username, and then also return the response.json as form submitted successfully. So that's all good on that side. What we need to do now is in the React side over here, we also want to check with credentials in our Axios.get response. So what essentially happens is we fetch the CSRF token from the server. So we're getting it from the server, and then we want to include cookies in the request. So that's why we have with credentials true in there. So that's the first part complete. But then in the handle submit in here, we also need to do an extra check. So in here, we want to do with credentials true as well, because on the server, in this get request over here, we set a cookie over here, and that cookie is getting set in the cookie in our application tab. So let's find this cookie now. It should essentially be the same as this one over here in our response. So if we go into the browser and we search this, so copy this, and in application, in cookies, so again, what I think we need to run the server again once more. So let me just save everything and close this down, npm start. This one should be fine. In our browser, let's refresh. And now you can see the cookie is being set, which is this value over here. And this should be the same as what's in the console. So if you do Command F and V, you can see that's the same in there as well. So the first part is complete, and then we are essentially submitting the form. So that's what we need to do next, but we need to pass this argument in here, which is with credentials true. So that is basically including the cookie in the request as well. And then that is everything. So essentially now when we do our post request, so when we submit our form, what will happen is we will do an axios.post request to this submit form over here. So in our server, we are calling this endpoint here, app.post. We need to pass the CSRF protection over here, the middleware, and then this will respond with form submitted successfully. So in here, we have the form data, and then in our headers, we want to pass in the CSRF token in the headers and also include the cookies in the request. That is everything we need to do. So now let me just save it all and then close everything down, and we will restart the server and we will restart the React application. So if we look at the entire flow, what will happen is we set the CSRF token in the server. So in our Express app, we pass it down to the React app over here in the use effect. The use effect then sets the state of our CSRF token. And then that CSRF token is what we need to pass in the header of any requests that we make. So any HTTP requests, which in our case, we are requesting to submit this form. And then in the protection, it should include the CSRF token generated from our server. So from this API CSRF token endpoint, and it should also pass back to the server each time we make an API request. So essentially, each time the user has a session, each time the CSRF token will change, which again enhances security, and it also verifies that this person is who they actually are. So now what we want to do, we've fetched the token from the server. That's fine. But now we want to submit the form, which is to /API/submit form. And let me just put in Imran codes in here. And in the header, so in the payload, we want to be able to pass this back in to say, this is actually who we say we are. So let me press submit. And now you can see it says form submitted successfully. So now I can press OK. And that is how the flow works with CSRF protection. So again, if you read this, this is very handy, especially when you're working in a production environment, because you need to make sure that your customers are safe. You need to make sure that your app is safe and that you don't have any attacks on your server or your application. So this is important. If you look at the blog over here, there's reasons why, and I've included them in here. So here you can see, without proper validation, this request can carry out sensitive actions such as transferring funds, deleting records, or changing account details. This is just some of the examples, but you need to think and get into this mindset as well, that when we're working with front end and back end and so on, we need to think about security, because that is very important in a production environment. So that is how you would do it with CSRF, the package. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a middleware that will do this for you if you don't have the capabilities to use an external package. So I will do that next. Right, so now that we've created our CSRF using an external package, what I want to do is show you how to do it without an external package. So if you wasn't allowed to use them, for example, then we will create our custom middleware. So in backend, let's create a new file, and you should put in middleware folder actually. So I'll do that. So middleware, because you should have multiple middlewares in a folder somewhere, and then this one will be called CSRF protection.js like that. I'm just going to bring in my code and then I'll explain what's going on because it's easier. So again, we have our CSRF middleware, and this is the function which contains quite a lot of information, and then we export it. So in the function, what we do, we have a token secret. Again, this should be very secret. It should be your own secret key, whatever it is you use. But again, this should be in an env file as well. You should hash it and so on. So that's the token secret. That's the first thing we need. Then we have a utility function to create a unique CSRF token. So in our case, we're using crypto, the package we've imported at the top, and then we are generating 32 hex over here. So generate a random 32 byte token. Second function is we need to hash the CSRF token as well. So again, we do the function to hash it. So these ones are important. We've got our secret here. We're hashing it over here. And then this is where we do our methods. So the first one is the get request. So let's do the get request first of all. So let me just bring this down. And then essentially, if a request method is get, which is quite simple, so we check the request method, then we create a CSRF token, which is the function above. We hash the token, so hash it there, and then we store the hash in a secure HTTP only cookie. So we can't access this by JavaScript. So this will be in setting a cookie. So request.cookie, we name it CSRF token in our side. So this is on the server. Again, we pass in our hashed token, which we have done over here, and then some options. So again, we need to set it to HTTP only true because that way we are on HTTPS. So that's very important. Same site of strict because this again prevents cross-site cookie usage. So we need that set as obviously strict, and then secure. Obviously, it should be true if it's in production. So that's just a no-brainer. We have to have HTTP only true and secure true as well, or just do true here. But again, in development, it's up to you how you want to do that. So again, expose the raw CSRF token in a non-HTTP cookie for front-end access. So again, what we are doing is pretty much the same, but we are again setting this for the client over here. And then the next is res request and next. So go on to the next thing. So again, there might be a get request and some other request as well. So go on to the next. Again, second part is we have post, put, and delete requests. So other methods that we have. So in our case, we was using the submit form method, which was a post request. So this is how we would handle it. So again, now that we've basically done this over here, we pass this information to the client in our use effect, which we have done in previously, and then we get access to the headers and we get access to the XCSRF token, which is the token from the client request, and then we get the one from the server as well. Then we just validate, obviously, if there's no client or server CSRF token, then we return 403 missing CSRF token, which is basically our guard clause to protect us. And then finally, over here, we validate the CSRF token. So in our case, CSRF token client hash, which is basically hashing this token, which we have defined in part two. So this one. And then what we want to do is make sure that, again, this is has to be the same from the server. So again, what we are doing is we are setting the token in the server, then passing that down into the client as we have done previously, and then they both have to be the same thing basically. So if they are not the same thing, then again return a 403. So we're handling that as well, and then we return next, and then again next again. So this is just basically the middleware that we have in place. So then obviously in our server now, so at the minute we have CSRF here, but what we can also do is we can do const CSRF middleware. I'll call it middleware like this. And then what you want to do is you can set it over here. So then what we are doing is we are using that, but we also need to pass the cookies before. So again, we need the cookies in both middlewares. So this is the one from CSRF package like this. And then this one is from, and actually these are from CSRF middleware like that. So this is our custom. And again, I should have renamed them to make sure they make more sense. So now we've done that, what we do in here in our first endpoint, so the get part of it. So in here, we have the get. So this method over here, we essentially want to pass in the get to the client. So again, you can paste this in, which again sends the CSRF token to the client from the custom middleware. And I'll do O, use the package below. So now what we are doing is we are using the CSRF token from the cookies, so request.cookies with the index of CSRF token client. So that is request.cookies CSRF token client, this one over here. And then that should handle the get method. So that is the get part. And then the post is basically it's all done in the client which we already have in place. So in our client in handle form, we pass in the headers and then we also have with credential true. So then the server will do all of that middleware checking for you. So in our case, this CSRF protection we've defined here, what we also want to do is we can instead do this one over here. So copy this and put this in place of the middleware. So let's just go into the CSRF protection one, which is our middleware here. And what happens is it will do the post check for us in the server. So again, we check that the token from the client and the server is the same. If they are the same, then obviously it should be fine. Then we can go on to our next function. So first of all, we check they both have a value. Then we check they are the same. If they're not the same on either of them, then we return the 403 response. So that is how you would build your own custom middleware as well. So what I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to install an Next.js application, and then we want to see if they have included the CSRF protection in their framework. So we'll do that next. Right. So if you think about CSRF for a moment and how it works in full stack frameworks, let's look at Next.js. You can see here they've created this blog, which is security Next.js server components actions, and this was done in 2023. But if you look at the security and search for Command F CSRF, and you can see there's 7 references to it. So you can see here a large source of CSRF issues are covered, and you can also see here they have a section on CSRF itself. So if you read this, it says all server actions can be invoked by plain form, which could then open up to CSRF attacks. Behind the scenes, server actions are always implemented using post, and only this HTTP method is allowed to invoke them. This alone prevents most vulnerabilities for CSRF in modern browsers, particularly due to same-site cookies being the default. As an additional protection, server actions in Next.js 14 also compares to origin header to the host header or X forward host. If they don't match, the action will be rejected. So that's good because we want that to happen. In other words, server actions can only be invoked on the same host. So that's important because again, when we was implementing our CSRF, we also want to make sure it's on the same site as well. And as the page that hosts it, which is correct, very old, unsupported, and outdated browsers that don't support the origin header could be at risk. So again, that's why we use new browsers like Chrome and so on. So again, server actions doesn't use CSRF tokens. Therefore, HTML sanitization is crucial. So again, this is to do with the server action security. So when a custom route handlers are used instead, extra auditing can be necessary since CSRF protection has to be done manually there. The traditional rules apply. So again, this is a consideration in Next.js where we need to think about CSRF tokens. But what I want to do is I want to just create a Next.js app, which I already have open. So again, let me just bring this in. And in this one over here, let me just close everything down and clear. So if I open this further, what I am doing is I've got this multi-brand YT, which is a Next.js app I did on my YouTube channel. But if we go into the node modules next dist in here, we have the server app render, and then we have the CSRF protection JS. So this is in the next node modules over here. And you can see all of the considerations that are taking place. So Micromatch is a package, a sub package that is handling the CSRF, but we don't need to worry about that. So essentially, we can ignore the comments, but here it says defines the property of the ES module, and then it defines the property of is CSRF origin allowed. Again, forget it's fine, it's allowed, forget methods. But then here we have a function that says match wildcard domain. Again, this does a whole lot of checks such as domain parts, pattern parts, and so on. But essentially, what it does is if it's an invalid pattern, pattern segments must not be held empty. Additional wildcards are only supported at domain level. So again, it should be server should basically match the client. So the domain should be the same. But they also have like functions like this. So in app render, if I go into here, scroll down, you can see there's a whole bunch of files in here that test the CSRF protection. And these are bundled, obviously, because these are the bundled versions of the file, the build versions of the files, but they have that implemented within their node module. So I'm not going to go into it much deeper, but they have also factored that in to their full stack framework as well. So again, we have some definitions in here. Main one being is CSRF origin allowed. So again, if it's true, then it will do something. If it's false, it will do something. So again, if you haven't considered it, then a framework of your choice may have already considered it, which is why it's important to know, which is why these blogs are handy. So the one on XJS, which is handy, and also the one I've just created here. But again, be sure to view this video again if it doesn't make sense, because initially it didn't make sense to me when I was looking at it. And there are plenty of packages out there that you can read the docs for and see if this is obviously whatever the package is that is best for you is, use that one. But essentially, that is CSRF tokens, and it will enhance and improve the security on your application. So it's a very important security measure to know. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.